Rodeo. And we are live. Hey everyone, welcome back to This Week at Work, where we bring you the latest trending news on organizations, technology, and the future of work. As always, I'm here with my partner in crime, Matt Burns. How are you, my friend?
Doing very, very well today. Thank you for asking.
Have you just broken into some stranger's house to do this show? Because where are you right now?
I'm at your mom's place.
Yeah,
it's nice.
You flew all the way to the UK just to do the show?
Yeah, I wanted to meet with my favorite Rainey, so here we are, and I'm also talking to you today as well.
Oh man, where are you in all seriousness right now? Because you're traveling.
I'm actually, and this is serious, I'm in Wawa, Ontario.
Okay, and that's a real place?
It's a real place. It's actually the place where you'll find the world's biggest Canada goose.
Okay, and what takes you there, Matt?
Well, as you know, I'm moving from Vancouver to Ottawa, so I'm day 7 into day 9 of that trip, and we're in Wawa, so here we are.
So you thought you'd just walk the way there?
I thought I would, meander my way to Ottawa. I mean, we had this chat last week. It's 4,600 kilometers, so
that's crazy.
I'm about 4,000 kilometers all the way there.
Yeah, we forget how big Canada is compared to the UK as well. That's insane. So how long's left of the trip?
2 days.
2 days, cool, man. All right, so next week you're going to be 2 days. So next week you're going to be in your home.
I'll be in Ottawa. I'll have the set ready to go, back in the familiar surroundings. It'll be great.
Nice. So what are we talking about today, Matt?
4-day work week seems like a good idea when someone's moving across Canada to talk about a 4-day work week. So
why not?
Yeah, why not?
It's interesting because we saw some data from our friends at CIPD. And they researched, of the 2,000 companies, they found that 34% of the companies that they surveyed around the 4-day work week, that most of them expect this to be into full effect in the next decade. However, only a 10th of the companies surveyed said that they would actually maintain full pay for the shorter hours. So what are we paying employees for hours or output? I suppose that's my first thought when I read that.
Well, I'm smiling because it's very predictable. I think that's where we're going. We're going to a place where people are demanding more work-life balance, and they're learning that time off in a 3-day work week provides extra benefits in terms of handling their domestic responsibilities, whether it's family or friends or other obligations. And the reality is, Chris, the vast majority of employees I know are working 40 hours in 4 days anyway. So in a lot of cases, we're talking about the same kind of work week. This is really just a recognition of what's happening. But as you can appreciate, this spins up a whole bunch of questions. The pay question, but also questions around accountability, availability. There, as we've discussed in previous podcasts, some roles just aren't fit for a 4-day work week. I think we're going to have a really cool conversation today about it.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. You're right. Yeah, I was thinking about the other one. Some roles, it doesn't work in that context. But then you mix in hybrid work into the mixture. Then it gets even more complicated. What days are you in? What days are you not? Out of those 4 days, it seems another fun thing to throw in the mix for HR executives.
Well, the schedule of itself is anchored in some sort of history. So while the vast majority of us who work in traditional salaried roles are used to the more Monday to Friday, Saturday, Sunday off, I grew up in a household where my father was a police officer, and he worked 4 days on and had 4 days off. and that was a rotation of shift schedule. You see that with nurses, you see it with doctors,
That's
you see
true.
it with firefighters, the 4 on, 4 off. And these are 12-hour shifts, mind you.
I'm about to say that that's because they're long hours as
Longer
well.
hours.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're doing days and nights. So there's a bit of a challenge around that. So there's question about whether that rotation makes sense. But the 4-day work week has been around for some time in certain roles. I think the question now is, does it make sense for a corporate environment? Chris, I think even about corporate roles such as sales, when you need to be available for your customer, when you need to be available for your business, try to coordinate people's schedules with a 4-day work week. I ask questions like, do we all take Fridays off? Do we all take Mondays off? Do we rotate the days off? Most consumers have an expectation that the businesses they interact with are available now 24/7. So how do we manage that expectation at the same time of reducing our work hours?
Yeah. Are you hearing people ask for this though? Like push for this?
Yeah, I think I mean, not any more than I heard before. I think there's a recognition of the fact that most of us are working more than 8 hours a day. And when you factor in things like the commute in a pre-pandemic world, it wasn't uncommon for me to work 12 to 14 hours a day when you factored in that commute. Now, when my commute is literally from the shower to the studio, it obviously that gets some time back. But additionally, my days have elongated because now working in a global context, I need to be available for people all over the world. I mean, Chris, you're in the UK, I'm in Canada. We used to have an 8-hour time spread. Thankfully, with my move, we'll now be a 5-hour time spread. But that's just a reality when you have team members around the world, customers around the world. We find ourselves being always on. And I don't know about you, Chris, but I'm seeing, increasingly an expectation that you just have your phone with you all of the time. So in that case, are you really off, even if you're not technically working?
Yeah, that's true. Well, about a year ago, I started taking off the Friday morning so I could spend it with Robin because I really wanted that quality time with her. And it's pretty much a whole day at that point. It's just up until 12 o'clock, and it hasn't really affected my work or impact with the team as well. It's interesting because another point in the survey, the majority of the employers surveyed believe that the 4-day work week is only possible by working smarter and adopting new technology. What do you think about that?
I totally agree. And I think you raised a good point around output versus time. I think we've all worked in examples of individuals who spend a lot of time in the office but aren't all that productive.
Yeah.
And we also know people who've been in the office quite infrequently but are more productive. But there's also that I've been in office situations where if somebody's ducking out at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, it's like, well, why are they? There's a bit of a social pressure on why are they leaving early. There's definitely this kind of intrinsic deeply held value for most people around availability equates to value when we're needing to transition to a place where output equals value. And I think, to your point, Chris, really, really smart to say technology needs to be part of this conversation, because if we're going to be less available in a physical context, we need to be as available in a digital context. I don't see how you would do this without technology.
Yeah. But also, and you need a technology there so managers and leaders have that visibility. They can see the outputs. Yep. I think that's the fear, right? Everyone's like, oh my God, I can't see them working in front of me. That means they're not doing any work. But now we have data, we have the dashboards, we can see, we use oneday.com at HR leaders, and it's pretty simple. Everyone knows who's working on what the deliverables are. It's very clear. We can see the workload of each department, of each employee. And it just puts me at ease knowing, and I don't care if you spend 2 hours to get the job done or 10 hours, I'm measuring the output. I'm not measuring the amount of hours you are. And I've always been that kind of person. Where in the past I got in trouble for not always being there for all day, all evening. I'm like, listen, I have a life outside of this. I'm going to come in, I'm going to deliver in the most efficient time, effective way for me, and then I'm going to leave. But you're right. I used to get a lot of those social pressures internally of like, you need to be seen to be in first and leave last. And, I think those days are gone, if I'm being honest.
I think so too, but I think we have to be mindful of a predictable clapback from individuals that may be less trusting of their employees. So while we've seen the proliferation of hybrid work, we've also seen the proliferation of tracking tools available to employers to manage things like keystrokes, what screens people are looking at. And that just basically creates a digital leash in lieu of a more physical leash. And my question, I think in certain situations that might work, but in a lot of situations, you're sending a very clear signal that you don't really trust your employees to do their work at all. And Chris, like in my situation, I have a similar belief as you. I actually want to incentivize people to be more efficient with their time. So if you can get your job done in 6.5 hours, bravo, you figured out how to do this more quickly. Can you teach the rest of us how to do this so that we can also be more efficient, rather than penalizing you and saying, okay, well, you did it faster. Now here's some more work.
Mm-hmm. And yeah,
That
it's
doesn't
also
that
like, what are you in? Are you incentivized? Also, how are you incentivizing people? Are you rewarding the people that work the most hours, or are you
yeah.
rewarding people that actually get the job done
Well,
and
there's science behind this
deliver?
too, Chris. I mean, Parkinson's law states that the work will expand to fit the time that you allocate towards it. Now, we talk about this a lot in the inverse. So we talk about this in terms of, if you're brainstorming, create constraints around time. So if you have something you need to make a decision on in 1 hour, give it an hour and then agree that after an hour, you'll make a decision. So we use this in the inverse to be more efficient. But when you look at this, the opposite direction, Parkinson's law can be taken. If you have 8 hours to get your daily job done, people will spend the entire 8 hours to get the work done, even though it could have taken them 5, because they don't, because they have the 8 hours to do this. But if we said to them, hey, you're going to be finished by 3 o'clock, surprise, surprise, I think the vast majority of employees would get their work done by 3 p.m. in the afternoon. So I think it's, to your point, the output versus input conversation is really relevant here. And at the end of the day, we should be managing and measuring outputs, because that's ultimately kind of the brass tacks of what we're doing at work.
Yeah. I've seen this. Did you want to jump in there, Bruno? Does someone have a question? I can see you getting no. Any questions you got in the chat, let us know. Bruno's monitoring the chat. I've seen this with, I use Upwork quite a lot for different projects, and a lot of them are fixed cost. And you'd be amazed how quickly they deliver on those projects, right? Because they're getting paid to deliver, the result. And for them, they're like, we can get this done in the most time efficient way as possible. Whereas if I've worked in the other way, where I've offered someone an hourly gig for the same job, they extend it as long as possible, as well. Yeah, of course, no surprise there, as well. Which is
well,
really,
it's incentives, right? Like if
yeah.
you're incentivized monetarily to take longer for a task, whether you're a consulting firm or a freelancer, it's the same way of approach things at Bento HR. If we create contracts based on time, then we have to account for the fact that all the hours worked need to be paid for. But if we create a fixed term contract or a fixed monetary contract, it's incumbent upon us to figure out a way to do this within that cost structure. And ultimately, we always figure out a way. So I think understanding the human incentives is just being real about, if you structure it in a way that compels people or encourages people to use time as the measure of value, they're going to elongate their time to maximize their value.
Yeah. No wonder my solicitors take so long, Matt, to get back to me. I'm like, why is it taking them so long to do that? Now I know why. What do you think the obstacles are going to be? What do you anticipate the obstacles are going to be?
I think they're pretty predictable. I think organizations are going to have a natural reaction. I think some employees are going to have a natural reaction to the idea of forward work week being kind of like easier than a 5-day work week. And in some cases, that might not account for the complexities people might have outside the workplace. I mean, Chris, you and I both know individuals that have children, who have parents living with them, who have both situations. They may have additional complexities that we're not talking about. In those cases, they're not putting their feet up an extra 1 day a week and sitting around watching TV. They got other responsibilities happening. I think that's one thing we have to account for, is we're going to have some differences of opinion within the organization around whether this is appropriate or not. Secondly, obstacles are going to be, you talked about it earlier, Chris, the technology and the tools. If we're going to treat this the way we treated work 3 to 4 years ago, and take this perspective of, we need to be able to see what you're doing, we need you to be in the office, this is going to be a more complicated initiative to roll out. I think ultimately it's, how do you as a manager better factor in things like delegation and managing and measuring outputs? The fact of the matter is that the vast majority of managers who struggled with the transition into hybrid work didn't have the management skills or have the knowledge or the experience to be able to lead a dispersed workforce. Chris, you and I have been doing this for 5+ years each. For us, it's become second nature, but along the way, it required a transition of, okay, I may not actually see this person on a day-to-day basis. How do I check in on how they're doing? How do I check in on the work? How do I support them when they have questions and obstacles? So I think those things come up for me in terms of the natural friction points are going to show up. And then I think logistically, Chris, I would add is, I mentioned this earlier, as a business that's expected to be available 24/7, 365, how do we manage coverage to meet customer expectations? Because ultimately, if we're not doing that, we don't have a business.
Yeah. I think you hit on such a good point with the management piece, because if you do this and you don't focus on that part first, the cultural shift, giving your managers the right training and resources and support that they need, it's going to be an absolute disaster. It's just gonna
Correct.
it's gonna be an absolute disaster. So we need to focus on that first before we do that. And also, 4 days doesn't mean less work. It doesn't mean that, like you said earlier. I think that's the first thing people think, right? They think 4 day work. Oh, it's 1 day less work. That we know that's not what we're trying to say. As well, I think, and if you give your employees the time to recharge, refresh, more time out, they're going to come back more energized anyway. Especially as you said, some great examples around employees that may have their parents living with them or kids or all of those things. People will make it work. And I always pick on my wife's company, but I'm going to pick on them again. If you're ever listening, financial ombudsman, don't track your employees. It's so frustrating. Even I'm working at home today with Tasha, and she was making Robin's lunch earlier, and she was like, "Oh, can you just press the key on the laptop, just so I don't time out?" Like, it's crazy. That you have to tap the key just to make sure that they know that you're still working. Otherwise, it logs out of the CRM and then shows that she's not working when actually she's feeding her child at lunch as well. We need to get away from the send such a bad signal, like you said, the lack of trust.
Well, and it creates a culture where if you're always managing to that expectation, it's going to affect things like your creativity, your innovation, your willingness to work with your team members. Creating space. I have this issue where if I feel like if I'm not doing anything, I'm not being productive. But the vast majority of the time that I'm actually sitting and I'm not doing something specifically, I'm thinking about work. I'm brainstorming about work. I'm solving for problems that I may not have been able to solve for if I sat in front of my computer and thought about it. So there is this shift that we all need to make around, to your point, being present doesn't necessarily mean that you're being productive. So how do we shift the expectation around that? Also, I think we need to account for the fact that the 4-day work week, I wouldn't look at this conversation so much as it has to be a 4-day work week. To me, it's a bigger conversation around we need to be more flexible with how the work is done. That might be 5 days, 6 hours a day, 8 hours a day. It might be 4 days, 12 hours a day. It's trying to allow the flexibility for the employees to figure out what would fit for them and how things can be managed in that context. I mean, Chris, we've seen this in areas with companies like Netflix offering unlimited PTO. And in those studies, when that's offered, the science actually says that people take less vacation.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? You just think everyone's scared, everyone's just going to turn up and no one's at work.
But the reality is, and people take less vacation in environments where there's unlimited PTO. So the fear around giving people more time off, and I'm using air quotes here, actually doesn't bear out in terms of the evidence, because people are naturally motivated intrinsically to do good work. They want to keep their employment. They want to contribute to the workforce. They feel connected to their organization and their fellow coworkers. They don't want to let their teams down. That, as a consequence, drives a lot more productivity than saying you should be at the office at 8:30 in the morning and you can't leave till 5. The intrinsic motivation is a far greater predictor of ultimately productivity and success than any kind of requirements organizations put on employees to be somewhere.
Yeah. I feel like all the organizations, for example, in those surveys, I'm sure if they were listening to this, they would agree. But yet, why do they the vast majority, should I say, still say that we are not willing to pay the same salary for 4 days? Even if people are delivering, is that just what do you think that's...
I think the perception is hard to overcome. I think, to your point, people assume 4 days a week, they're going to end up doing less work than they did before. The other question I would ask is the volume of work that people are doing right now actually real? Like, does anyone actually work a 40-hour work week? I don't know anybody.
Like every hour. I get what you're saying. Like, someone
right. Like, or is it actually more like 50 to 55 to 60 hours a week when you factor in things like commute or meetings before the meetings or meetings after the meetings or working on the weekend to catch up or getting on that Sunday evening, getting prepped for the week? Like, all that's work, which we don't get credit for in the organizational context, but ultimately is inputs into the organization. It's implicitly expected. No one says you have to do it, but if you don't do it, in some cases, you're showing up for the week not prepared. Like, there's a fallacy that people are working 40 hours and that this will reduce them to 32. I don't think that's actually fair in the vast majority of cases.
Or the rate that I'm seeing companies demand, I say demand, that's a bit of a strong word, ask employees to return to the office. I can't see this becoming commonplace, if I'm being honest. anytime soon.
The return?
The 4 days, I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I feel like every, friends, family, CHROs I speak to every day, it's like, okay, come back 1 day a week. Oh, and now 2 months later, it's 2 days a week. Now it's 3 days a week. Now it's 4 days a week. Now it's basically back in the office.
Yep.
Yeah. With no, I wish I could remember the way Dave Orick put it yesterday. Bruno, I don't know if you can remember the way Dave quoted about why we should bring people back to the office. He put it really amazingly. I'll link it in the comments as well. But the research basically shows that people come back to the office to see each other.
Yep.
Not to do work or to sit there on a laptop and type away. They come back for human connection. As well, and some reason organizations aren't getting that as well.
Yeah, I think ultimately, if you shift to a paradigm where we're measuring outputs, like you suggested earlier, Chris, then we don't need to bother ourselves with the time and the inputs.
Yes,
because we're just measuring outputs. If I expect you to do these 6 things by the end of the week, and these 6 things are done, I don't care what hours you do them. I don't care whether you're in the office or not. But that's a fundamental shift, and it requires a greater degree of leadership and supervision to manage that. You need to establish with intention the tasks that are due at the end of the week. You need to have a mechanism to track and measure and manage and follow up with those tasks. And Chris, when I was in corporate environment, a lot of the time as a leader, I was actually an individual contributor masquerading as a leader. I myself had 50 to 60 hours of individual work on top of managing and measuring my employees.
I know that.
So before we dump all over managers in this case, let's be clear, 100%. A lot of them are juggling full workloads themselves or may not have actually been given proper training on how to supervise work in a remote setting, in a digital setting. These are skills that we have not necessarily learned organically, whereas being in the office and following that rhythm of the day is something that most of us are familiar with. So we can replicate even our own experiences, even in cases where it's not the most productive for the organization or for the employees, but we've learned that. So we're just going to replicate what we've seen and experienced ourselves.
Yeah. Matt, having been a CHRO at many global companies, what does the decision-making on something like this look like? Would this sit with HR? Where would this typically sit, a decision like this?
Yeah, I mean, this is not an HR decision. This is a business decision. The organization, in the broad sense, needs to understand the implications of it. HR needs to be involved from a employee sentiment perspective, an employee engagement perspective, performance management, development. Those things need to be factored in, but this needs to be an executive team decision involving the CEO, the CFO, the chief operating officer, the CHRO, the CTO, the entire team, because it's going to affect everybody, both individually, but also in the collective sense. So this needs to be a broad conversation. I would also essentially recommend that if a company is going to go through this approach, develop really clear measures of what success looks like, because you're going to get people along the way who are going to challenge the validity of it, the efficacy of it, and ultimately the practicality of it. So if you don't have clear measures of what success would look like in a future state, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle to justify whether this makes sense or not. And if things don't go according to plan, you have the opportunity then to adjust and react and amend things to actually achieve those outcomes. So I think, again, it's being intentional about the focusing on the outputs that really is the salvation around this. It needs to be a broad-based decision.
Mm-hmm. Cool. I think that's about it, Matt. I feel like we covered it. For anyone in the chat, let us know your thoughts as well. It's an interesting topic. And my Alexa started talking to me. Alexa, stop. Sorry about that.
Alexa's 24/7.
I know. That's the number. I can't escape her. No, that's the thing as well. But one other thing I want to mention, there's so many of you already that work with Matt. But Matt, Bento HR, for people that want to work with you, where can they connect with you as well? Because over the last couple of episodes, you've had a number of companies reach out to you that are working with you and the team at the moment. But where can people reach you?
Just find me on LinkedIn, and I would extend beyond just work, Chris, just questions. I know this is a challenging time for leaders as they navigate this post-pandemic landscape, try and figure out what makes sense for them as leaders and as organizations. Just find me on LinkedIn, send me a direct message. I am moving the next couple of days, so my response times might be a bit challenged. But next week, I'm all set up, got my Wi-Fi going. I'm eager to get back into work.
Amazing. Well, look, that's it all for today's episode. If you haven't already done so, click on Matt's page and my page. There's a new little feature on LinkedIn. There's a little bell icon. Make sure you hit the bell icon, because next time we go live, you'll get a notification. So take a second to do that. Apart from that, enjoy the weekend, everyone, and we'll see you all next week. See you later, everyone. Bye-bye.